Good evening. This week's question time comes from Slough. And a big welcome to our audience here and, of course, to our panel, the Business Secretary, Vince Cable, the Shadow Attorney General, Emily Thornberry, the Conservative MP, Claire Perry, the Deputy Leader of the UK Independence Party, Paul Nuttall, and from the Huffington Post website, Mehdi Hasan. And good. Our first question comes from Eamon Barrett, please. Eamon Barrett.
With today's announcement on the GDP figures, are we seeing the first signs of green shoots?
Paul Nuttall.
Well, I think initially the figures look rather positive, and let's thank God that we're out of recession. I mean, manufacturing is up, unemployment is down, but there are some negatives in there. I mean, the construction industry seems to have bottomed out. Youth unemployment is still around 20%, which is totally unacceptable. And I do question whether these figures are actually real, because if you think of the quarter that these figures were taken, it was from July to September when we had the Olympic bounce. In fact, Olympics ticket sales amounted to, I think it was 0.2% of GDP, although they're counted in these figures. The ticket sales necessarily didn't take place at that point. So I do worry that the figures are false, and I do worry that we will regress afterwards. But the real issue with our economy at the moment is actually national debt. That's more important, because whilst you're sitting here and you're watching this programme, and for the people at home, in the hour that this programme takes place, our national debt would have grown by 18.5 million. That's 18.5 million every hour. It's about 450 million a day. So by 2014, we could have a national debt of 1.4 trillion. And what we're doing is we're putting a noose round the neck of our next generation. We're putting a noose round the neck of our children and our grandchildren, because they will have to pay off the debt that this generation has built up, and I think it's unfair, and the national debt is something that we have to get hold of. But as I'll go back to the question, I think it is positive, but I do worry that these are false figures.
Okay. Vince Cable, is that an accurate description of the way the national debt is going?
Well, national debt is a problem, but it's only one part of a much bigger picture. To answer Eamon's question, I wouldn't use the phrase green shoots. It's been used, unfortunately, before. I think that it's encouraging, particularly when you take it in conjunction with some of the other things that have happened. We've got employment growing, unemployment falling. Admittedly, it's too high. We've got inflation falling as well. But the problem is that our problems as a country are very, very, very deep-rooted. We had what I would call the equivalent of an economic heart attack 4 years ago. The financial system almost collapsing. It's left a dreadful legacy. The banks still don't function properly. We've got households, families that still have too much debt in many cases, are worried about spending. Governments inherited this enormous deficit we're trying to deal with, and we've now got serious problems in some of our export markets, particularly the Eurozone, which is partly what accounts for the bad news we had today on the vans being produced in Southampton. So, the problems are very deep. Today's news is encouraging. In the government, what we have to do is to try and stick to a sensible path, and that means partly concentrating on getting the finances of the government in order, and that's a big long-term task, and it's difficult. But at the same time, trying to create growth on a steady, sustainable basis.
When you say you won't use the word green shoots, do you mean you don't anticipate or can't promise that growth is going to go on upwards?
No, I can't promise, because it's the phrase that the Governor of the Bank of England used this morning is zigzag, and that may be what happens. And there are major areas of weakness in the economy, and construction, as Paul said, is one of them. The banking sector is another. It's still in terrible shape. It's still not lending to small businesses, and those are the things we've got to work on.
Eamon Barrett, you're in the construction industry, aren't you, yourself? Do you feel there are green shoots around?
I think things are picking up. There's a lot of people I know that weren't working 6 months ago, and now they're working, not full-time maybe, but a few days a week, and jobs here and jobs there. It's definitely picking up, I think, anyway.
Mehdi Hasan.
So, some of us have been asking the government for a few months now, what is the plan B? What's plan B? And we now discover that plan B is basically Mo Farah and Jessica Ennis using the Olympics to get this boost. I don't get to say this very often, but I'm with the deputy leader of UKIP. These are false figures. They have a one-off boost from the Olympics. They have a one-off boost from recovering from the Diamond Jubilee bank holiday. The inconvenient truth is that if you look over the course of a year, rather than a single quarter, we haven't grown at all. There's been zero growth over the past 12 months. The economy today is the same size as it was a year ago, and construction shows 2.5% down. Yeah. The government talks about healing. David Cameron's been using the phrase healing. It's an odd kind of healing. If you went to your doctor and he said a year after treating you, you're exactly the same as you were a year ago. That's how much you've improved, because the medicine's not working. Austerity is not working. You know, some of us warned it wouldn't work back in 2010. In fact, there was a guy before the last election, I think his name was Vince Cable, who said that if you cut too soon, you will tip the country into recession, which is what happened. I wonder what happened to that man. The reality on the ground... The reality on the ground is the Trussell Trust, which runs 270 food banks in this country, is feeding 110,000 hungry people over the past 6 months. There's still 2.5 million people unemployed in this country. That's on top of 1.4 million people who are having to work part-time because they can't find full-time work.
But the question was whether these figures are the first sign of green shoots.
If I'm one of the long-term unemployed, these aren't green shoots.
You mean it's not going to go on getting better in your view?
No, I think the next quarter we won't see anything matching this. I think there's a very real risk, as many economists in the city have warned, of a triple-dip recession. And I think that what you have to look at is what's happening on the ground, not one single quarter's figures.
OK. The woman in the fourth row there with spectacles on.
How do you suggest we maintain the momentum gained by the Olympics for our economy?
How do you suggest you maintain... What, like having Olympics every year?
Well, we only get it every 50 years, so it's not really a viable growth.
Well, can I, if I could, I think this is probably the most important question, so well done for leading off on it. I mean, I think Mehdi, you know, for all your ranting, Mehdi, if this was a single data point, there would be some questions around it. There is a whole stream of good data that came out this week. We had unemployment falling, inflation falling, the deficit down by 25% since the election. We're coming out of the biggest recession we've had in Britain in peacetime history, and we are dealing with it, and we are starting to see real growth. And yes, the Olympics contributed to that. We had the highest rate of business creation ever in this country last year. This is real growth being generated by the private sector, who've created over 1 million jobs since the election. It is real growth. It might be choppy going forward, but it's real growth.
Is the Olympics partly public sector investment?
Well, I think that may have something. That may explain some of the. Well, it may explain some of the construction drop-off. As a government that is undertaking all of the really big infrastructure projects that have been ducked by the last Labour government, whether it's renewing sewers, putting in high-speed rail, all the tough stuff, it doesn't buy you many votes, David, but it's the right thing to do. But can I just say this? Who go home tonight and talk about the growth figures and the deficit? We won't. We'll go home tonight and talk about the fact that the cost of living is still tough. It's 60 shopping days till Christmas. People are going to have to start paying utility bills because we've got a cold snap coming. And what we have to keep doing is relentlessly focusing on the cost of living, because in my constituency, we don't talk about the deficit and borrowing. We talk about what's coming into our households and what's going out. And that's why freezing the council tax, freezing fuel duty, these are the things that actually make a difference in people's pockets.
As a trade unionist, I object to the government ranting all the time about the Labour Party did this, the Labour Party did this. You need to look back at when Margaret Thatcher sold off all the social housing. Now, I agree, we've brought our house and I think it's a good opportunity, but it was all flags and whistles. Now there are people who can't even afford to live in their own homes. Right. There's no social housing, right. And you expect us to believe you? I'm sorry.
Do you believe the figures that show that the double-dip recession may be over, or do you think things are going to get worse?
I think that the figures they put out today are a load of lies.
OK. And the woman in red there.
I just wanted to take Claire Perry up on the fact that she just said the deficit was down by 25%. Isn't that a complete fallacy? Because I remember watching another news programme produced by the BBC, and they suggested that actually that the data point that George Osborne collected the data from gave this impression that the deficit was down by 25%, but actually if we wait until the end of the year, the deficit's only actually down by 2.5%.
Okay, well, Emily Thornberry, would you like to comment on that and on the issue whether the whole thing is a load of lies in your view, which is the point that was made up front here?
I think this is good news. I do think it's good news. I think 1% growth is good news. But the reason it's good news is because we're coming out of a recession. Why are we coming out of a recession? Because we've had a second recession. We've had a double-dip recession. And why have we had that? That's because of choices this government has made. There's only been 2 countries in the G20 that have had a double-dip recession, and one of those has been ours. And what worries me is this good news will just result in this government becoming even more complacent. They'll sit back and they'll say, oh, everything's working, everything's fine. We don't need to invest in social housing. We don't need to make sure that we have more jobs for young people.
Forgive me, but
when it comes to long-term unemployment,
when have we ever said, under your
do
government,
tell me whether or not you're going to be investing
social
in
housing
housing
dropped to the lowest level since the 1920s.
Council housing.
Social housing is one of the biggest problems in my constituency. A third of my caseworkers, people who cannot find affordable housing, thanks to the disastrous legacy your government left. We are doing all we can to build social housing. It's the biggest problem facing young people today is they can't buy a house and they can find nowhere to rent. You should be apologising, Emily, for your track record.
My area, the area that I represent, 40% of the people in my constituency live in social housing. And what we did see over the time of a Labour government, since you raised it, Claire, was all the social housing in my constituency got done up. It was in the most disgusting state, frankly, when the Tories came out of government, and we did it all up. I don't think we built enough, and I think that when we're coming out of a recession, what we should be doing is we should be making good decisions about how we invest in our infrastructure, and we should be investing in our infrastructure by building homes, and building homes particularly for youngsters. I am really concerned about long-term unemployment and long-term unemployment amongst the young. You know that in Berkshire, which frankly, is a mixed area, it has a lot of posh bits, but nevertheless, 12 months ago, 100 youngsters had been claiming JSA for a year. Do you know how many are claiming it now in Berkshire? 400. And 100 of those are in Slough. If you are a youngster, if you're 18 and you claim benefits for a whole year and you're not able to get a job, it will make a huge difference to your life. And those mums and dads who've done their best to bring up children as best they can and push them out into the world, and the world is just saying, no, sorry, don't need you. If you've got a younger brother, we might be interested in 5 years' time. That is the tragedy of this recession. It is really urgent that we invest now.
All right, thank you. And to take a couple more points. Now go on, the man there in the middle.
Thank you. During an earlier recession at the beginning of the 90s, which was also quite a bad one, not as bad as this one, but for the years up until 1997, the Labour Party said, things are still getting worse, nothing's getting better, we're in recession. They ridiculed John Major, they ridiculed Ken Clarke, they ridiculed Norman Lamont, and lo and behold, about 4 or 5 years after, they suddenly thought that now Labour was in power, things have turned around, they're getting much better, and actually the statistics were so far out of date that as to be laughable. What we need are accurate statistics, independent statistics, which we should be getting now.
Which is what we do. They are, sir. I mean, we had I'm sorry to interrupt you.
But are they any more accurate?
So we have we set up the Office for Budget Responsibility, was something that I think is not necessarily something Gordon Brown and the previous government believed in, to try and address this problem, try and address the problem that the Treasury made up the numbers. They made up the numbers, and now we have an independently verified set of numbers. Now, they might well
get revised. The Prime Minister is ticked off for announcing in advance.
Well, before
good news.
What? No, he didn't announce.
On the OBR, very quickly, on the OBR, the Office of Budget Responsibility predicted in 2010, 2 years ago, that by now we would have had 4.6% of growth.
Right.
4.6% of growth. Do you know how much growth we've had over 2 years? Do you know how much growth we've had over 2 years?
We've had
all right,
0.6%.
Emily, I'm going to
0.6 versus 4.6.
I'm going to
that is a failure.
Your contribution in favour of Vince Cable, because you are both part of the same.
He is a far more senior member.
He's not a senior member. He's the Secretary of State.
There is a striking irony. Your question about statistics. When we had bad news the last few quarters, most of our critics rushed out and said, "Well, this is a complete disaster. The figures are obviously right." Now we've got some good figures. Our critics come out and say, well, they're obviously fixed.
They're fixed. They're inflated.
Okay, but if I could just deal with the criticism I had a few moments ago about cutting too fast. I did say that, and I would still say that. The government has got a very, very difficult balancing act. On the one hand, we have to cut our deficit. It is massive. It is the biggest in the developed world, an enormous budget deficit. We have to deal with it. If we do it too fast, yes, you're right. You do drive the economy down. If you don't do it fast enough, you lose the confidence of the people who are lending to you. And striking that balance is extraordinarily difficult. The bit of austerity, actually, that did the biggest damage was in that 2009-10. I think the then Chancellor slashed the public investment in the kind of things Claire was talking, infrastructure. That has done terrible damage to the construction industry. We've steadily rebuilt that. But we have to get the budget deficit under control. We argue it should be done over a 6-year period. You may argue that that is too quick. The Labour Party have said it should be over 7 years. I mean, you know, big deal.
Vince,
that's the kind of period we're talking about.
I mean, Erin, you may say we've got it wrong. We have had
I'll say
what you've said that you would like to cut the deficit. What would you like to cut? Name one thing that the Labour Party has supported us on in terms of reductions. Anything.
All right, Emily, a brief answer. And then
okay. I think that we should be responsible when it comes to cutting back money that we're investing in the police force. And I think you are cutting the police force far too much. We have lost 6,000 frontline police officers.
And
you were warned that
Emily,
if you want me to answer them, let me answer. So,
Claire,
you know, if you go and cut investment in police officers, the amount that you were warned that you would lose frontline police officers. We have
I think
what
we're
saying
saying was, where would you cut?
Well, what I'm saying is what we've said is that we would cut investment, we would cut the money that we pay to the police force in line with that which has been advised, which would not result in cuts in frontline police officers. That's the difference, and that is the difference between what you're doing, which is going, as we're saying, too far and too fast and resulting in a double-dip recession.
All right.
Of course we have to pay back the debt and the deficit, but we have to do it in a responsible way and in a way that keeps us together as a country.
All right, we must go on, when we get to the next question, I must ask the panellists just to speak slightly less long, or at slightly less length, so that we can get more members of the audience in who are keen to get in, and the panellists can come back on each other. But if you want to join in the debate tonight, on Twitter you can go there, as you know, our hashtag, you know well, BBCQT. You can follow the Question Time account. We have our Twitter panelist, as we've had for the last 2 weeks there. You can text comments to 83981. You can press the red button on the thingy to see what others are saying. What do you call that? Zapper.
Zapper.
And zap the red button. The remote. I thought for a time you tap the red screen. Well, you can anyway. Okay, let's go on to another question anyway. Angela Kirk has this one, please. Angela Kirk.
Is the proposal to limit child benefit to the first 2 children fair and reasonable?
Right, this is a proposal that Ian Duncan Smith has been making these last 2 days. He made a speech this evening saying that the benefit system promoted destructive behaviour, and on the Today programme he said, my view is that you need a cap on child benefits at 2 children. For those who begin to have more than, say, 2 children, you should stop it. Is it a good idea for the government to do this? Is the government going to do it? Emily Thornberry.
Well, I don't really know where to start with this. I think that it is absolutely extraordinary for politicians to go around pontificating and telling people how many children they should have. I think that people have children for love and not for money. I think that it is extraordinary. I do think that it's a distraction technique. I think that it's trying to distract the public from what this government is actually doing. Ian Duncan Smith has agreed to cut another £10 billion from the welfare budget, £10 billion. That's at the same time as them giving £40,000 tax cuts to millionaires. So they give the millionaires £40,000 and they expect the poorest to be making their contribution by another £10 billion. How can it be that they can start making decisions about how many children people should have and start penalising people? Presumably they've completely...
Is there a difference between telling people how many children they can have, as in China, and simply not giving benefit to families who have more than 2 children? Is there a difference?
If you're the 4th child born into a poor family and your family are therefore no longer getting that money? Is it your fault? Should you be in a family that is even poorer? What do they expect people to do? Do they expect them to starve their children? What are they expecting here? Surely we should have a government that actually cares about child poverty, that wants to do something about it, that doesn't start trying to penalise people because of the choices that they have made. It seems to me the most dreadful thing. And we talk about the nasty party and then wanted to move away from being the nasty party. It strikes me this is exactly from that stable.
Paul Nuttall.
Well, I must say, I must pay tribute to Ian Duncan Smith. I mean, this is a guy who knows his brief. He spent 8 years researching this before he went into government. He refused to be moved and reshuffled as well. I mean, he understands his brief, and I don't agree with much that the coalition does, but I do believe that they're getting this right on welfare and benefits, because under Labour, welfare exploded. It rose by 60% between 1997 and 2010. It was unsustainable. It's cost each household in tax £3,000 a year. But what we must be careful of doing is we shouldn't stigmatise people on welfare. You know, there's graduates coming out of university who can't get jobs. There are people who are being affected by the cuts who are coming out of work and can't get jobs. However, there is a growing underclass in this country. You know, I'm from Bootle, which is one of the poorest constituencies in the country. We have the lowest life expectancy in England, and I see it every day. You know, you've got one family who live there. Dad goes out to work, maybe on the docks, maybe in a factory. Mum goes out, stacks shelves in Asda, and they live within their means. They make that decision. Then you've got the family next door on benefits, who still have the flat screen television, still have a car, and can afford to go on holiday once a year. What it's doing, this system, is it's creating resentment within the working class community, and it's splitting the working class community.
Paul, I'll come back to you. Sure. Let's just hear some... All right, the gentleman there in blue, and then the woman in red next.
I think that the issue is parental responsibility. I've got a son. I wouldn't bring another child into the world if I knew I couldn't afford to pay for a second child.
Absolutely.
I think it's a naive view. Unfortunately, it's a naive view to say that people bring children into the world for love, because it's a fact, there are people who have children simply to claim benefits. And it's unfortunate, but successive governments have not done anything about it, unfortunately.
The woman in the third row from the back with spectacles.
It's all very well saying this, people should limit their families, but what about the family with 3 or 4 children now who suddenly would find their child benefit cut? Are they supposed to throw a child into the bushes and say, oh, that's fine, we'll just keep these 2?
Claire Perry.
Mrs Kirk, you may be better informed than me. I think IDS was talking about the overall benefit package, not child benefit. I mean, child benefit is already being restructured. It's going to not be paid to the richest 15% of families in the country. And frankly, the average income in my constituency is £25,000, and I don't think it's fair to tax those people to pay child benefits to MPs like Emily and I. I just don't think that's right.
Child-related benefits.
But child-related benefits, I have to say, I do agree with the gentleman in the blue. It's in the question of fairness. I don't think it's fair that families on benefits... Oh, I don't want to stigmatise. I'm afraid I disagree with you slightly on this, Paul. You can't stigmatise people and characterise them in certain ways. But it is not fair that the decisions they make are different from the decisions people in work have to make. And many people think very hard, as the gentleman said here, about the cost of bringing up a child, the cost of moving house, what it would cost to provide an extra bedroom. What Ian Duncan Smith is saying is people on benefits should be making those same sorts of decisions.
Is it fair and reasonable then, in your view, in Angela Kirk's question, is it fair and reasonable to limit these child-related benefits?
I think it is fair and reasonable. I would want to see the transitional arrangements. So to the lady's point here, of course you wouldn't expect families that already had 3 or 4 children to suddenly lose it. You would want to be providing a very strong signal going forward and making sure the transition... But, you know, it is fair that people on benefits have to think the same way as people in work. We want people on benefits to move into work, not to be on benefits for a lifetime.
Right, I think we have your point. Mehdi Hasan. Mehdi Hasan.
I think the government has a wonderful new slogan: tough on babies, tough on the causes of babies. I'm astonished at where this coalition goes with the policies and where it comes up with these policies. And, you know, Paul, with respect, you say that we have a system that creates resentment. No, we have politicians who create resentment when they talk about people in this way with flat-screen TVs and holidays. Let's cut through some of the myths and lies for a second here. In this country, Ian Duncan-Smith was talking about poverty and talking about child poverty and talking about welfare. In this country, 6 out of 10 children who live in child poverty live in working, not work-less households. But we stigmatise them all as living in lazy, feckless households. And as for large-sized families, which Ian Duncan-Smith was talking about this morning on the Today programme, if you look at his own department's figures, you see that there are 40,000 families claiming out-of-work child-related benefits who have 5 kids or more, which is 3% of the total. In fact, 80% of people on benefits, claiming child-related benefits, have 2 kids or less. So let's not start generalising based on Daily Mail scare stories about the one woman who has 10 kids. And just very quickly, the gentleman in the audience, I take your point about your own situation, but if tomorrow, thanks to this government's mismanagement of the economy, you lost your job, would you then want to lose your benefits through no fault of your own? Would your child have to suffer because you did nothing wrong?
That's not what I said. My actual point was that people need to take more responsibility.
But what if you lose your job?
Well, if you lose your responsibility, then you're a viable case, and it should be done on a case-by-case basis, and not, I have 5 children, I get this much money. That's not what I said.
But Paul Nuttall, you want to come back on the point Mehdi said about your characterisation of...
I think you'd have to be mad to claim that there isn't a significant underclass in this country, and there is. I worked with well, I'm telling you, there is a significant underclass in this country, and it's been born out of a benefits and a welfare system, which when Beveridge, no, it's
born out of unemployment. There are 4 million people in this country looking for full-time work.
All right, one at a time. Mehdi, you've had your say. Let him reply to the attack you made on him.
He didn't mean it to be set up like this, because what we've got now at the moment is we've got a benefit system which should be a safety net for the needy, but in some cases, and I hasten to say, some cases, what it's become is a career path and a vehicle for people who just don't want to work.
All right.
Can I come back?
No, in a moment, you can. Vince Cable, is this a proposal that you support?
No, and it wouldn't, if that is the proposal, it wouldn't be fair and reasonable. It isn't government policy. I don't think that's actually what he said. I mean, if you're talking about child benefit, Claire has accurately described the way in which we're changing it, which is to withdraw it from high earners. If you're talking about child tax credit, which is what people get when they're in work, and as Mehdi said, most people who are poor are in work, the child tax credit has actually been significantly increased. I mean, let me just
hold on. It's your. I mean, you're in the government with him, in work and pensions, and it's what he said on the Today programme was he suggested a cap on child-related benefits at 2 children. In other words,
well, we don't agree with that.
All right, so that won't happen. You'll block it.
We've made it very clear we will not go along with welfare caps which are unfair.
And you deem
and I would deem
that
that is almost certainly right. But I would say...
Sorry, just to get this absolutely clear,
we would not support it.
It's unfair because it says 2 children and that's it?
Yes, that is exactly right. I mean, what we do feel, and I mean, I would say this, Ian is a very decent, humane and good minister, and the principle he's trying to address, and has done since we came in, is that it is fundamentally unfair for people to be better off out of work than in work. That's the fundamental unfairness that he's trying to deal with, and we're trying to deal with that through welfare reform, through the universal credit, and he deserves a lot of praise for what he's done in that respect. But this particular proposal, I mean, I don't know whether this is kite flying or a misunderstanding of what he said, wouldn't be acceptable.
Okay. Emily Thornberry, just briefly, if you would, and then we must...
I think some members of the panel are labouring under this misunderstanding about the number of people who are working and who are also getting benefits. You talked at the beginning of the programme, sir, about how some of your friends are starting to work, but they're working part-time. The only way in which people can work part-time and make ends meet in somewhere like Berkshire is if they're getting housing benefit, and if they're getting tax credits, and if they're getting child benefit. They do their best to get a job, they do their best, they're striving away, but the idea that some government then turns around and says, well, I'm sorry, but you're on benefits and you've got 2 children, we're going to have to start taking your money away. I mean, what is this about? This is not about a party that is interested in one nation. And can I just say one other thing? You know, I hear what Vince says about this brave new world that IDS is bringing in. But, you know, everyone within Westminster knows that the Universal Credit is in trouble. Their IT programme is over budget. It is coming in much later. We also know that there were all sorts of rumours about them trying to sack IDS. You know, and frankly, as I say, this is a distraction. This is him desperately trying to hold on to his job and saying, look, David Cameron, I can push us up in the polls by coming out with
all
this
right, well, you can answer that point. Do you think he's just trying to hold on? Is he trying to hold on to his job, and is he in danger of being sacked?
IDS recognises the problem that we have 5 million people of working age receiving benefits in this country. We created 2.4 million jobs under Emily's government, and half of them went to people who came from abroad, whilst people...
But hang on a second, you can go on for hours about all the many problems. But David, the question is IDS just saying this?
No, IDS has brought in
Vince
a welfare...
said it might be kite flying, is it not?
IDS is 100% committed to resolving the very tough problems we have, which is that we have an incredibly complex, badly structured welfare system.
And you think his job's safe?
And the most popular thing we have done is introduce a welfare cap that means people on benefits can't earn more than those in work. And Emily voted against that.
All right.
It's shocking.
The man in the third row there, please. And then we must move on, I think. And the woman there up... yes.
I'm not a UKIP man, but I do agree with Paul Nuttall on this. And he mentioned the term resentment, that it's causing resentment amongst the working classes. Yeah. That is true, but I think the bigger resentment that people are not looking at is the I mean, we're talking tens of billions here, trying to shave off tens of billions, but the hundreds of billions, possibly even trillions, that are avoided in terms of taxation. And I think that should be the very, very incisive focus. I think there's quicker wins there if there's the willpower to do it. And Claire said at the beginning that we should back off the financial sector. So there's always some protectionism going on, and that I find more resentful.
All right, and the woman there in red, who I said I'd come to. Yes.
Yeah, what I was going to say was they could recoup a lot of money by hitting hard at people who defraud the benefit service. Instead of nowadays, they just get a slap on the wrist.
All right, and the woman at the back there, but in the back row.
Good evening. Bearing in mind that we have the highest number of single mothers in Europe, why should single women who choose to become pregnant get free housing and benefits, whereas other young people work hard, pay tax, and can hardly afford a one-bedroomed home?
And you, sir, yeah.
I was wondering actually where are you getting these numbers again from, because I got a sense that the Conservative government is picking the numbers that it is suitable for them, but the real numbers, the numbers that showing the problems for everybody is somehow being hidden or brushed under the carpet all the time.
What do you mean? That the statistics are wrong?
The statistics are sort of being picked up by certain... The good statistics are being picked up, but proper statistics are not being brought up into the air and discussed.
All right. We have to leave it there because we've got many more questions, and I'd like to go on to one from Catherine Sharp, please. Catherine Sharp.
Has the BBC been fatally damaged in the public's mind as a result of the Jimmy Savile scandal?
Claire Perry.
Do you know, the more that comes out, to somebody who used to love Jim will fix it, the more disgusting and distressing actually the situation is. Frankly, the man was obviously a predatory paedophile who plied his trade for 40 years under 5 successive Director Generals. I don't think it's particularly helpful now to have a firestorm over who knew what when and the Newsnight programme. The thing I find most worrying, and I think it's the same in the Rochdale grooming cases, is the voices of the victims I think have been completely ignored. And I am sick to death of young women coming forward years later for whatever reason, not feeling that they could be believed or listened to, and that I think is the real tragedy. I want to focus on that and make sure that doesn't happen again. And frankly, the BBC I think is doing a bit too much navel gazing over who knew what when.
Mehdi Hasan.
for the first time in my life, I literally agree with every single word that Claire Perry just said.
We'll get you voting Tory one day,
Not
Mehdi.
quite, because a lot of your fellow Tory MPs, of course, are pushing the anti-BBC bandwagon. I agree with you. The BBC has clearly failed in many areas. There's 2 investigations going on. Let's wait for their results. I suspect the BBC won't come out so well out of either of them. But let's not be distracted by this media navel-gazing, whether Panorama is leading on Newsnight's leading on Panorama, the 10 o'clock news is leading on both. It's absolutely absurd, the kind of journalists obsessing over the BBC. I mean, look, whatever they did wrong, and we don't know what they did wrong, George Entwistle and Peter Rippon did not sexually abuse children. Jimmy Savile did. And Jimmy Savile got away with it. Those women were abused, they were ignored. We need to focus on how he got away with it, and I'm sorry if it sounds cliched, to stop such things from happening again. That surely is the priority here. Giving those women voices, trying to get some closure, trying to get some justice. And I'm glad the CPS this week has actually come out with practical things it's going to do to try and investigate these crimes and stop this from happening again. This is not a media regulation story. This is a child sex abuse story.
In this vast media industry, I think Jimmy Savile is just tip of the iceberg, because as there are 2 women in the panel here, I don't think he's the only one, because there are many men, because most men are the top jobs here, and this is what they do to most women. And what do they say to them? Oh, well, if you did this, that's how you'll stay on the job. And that's the main reason why they kept their mouths closed. Now, this is an assumption I'm making, but as an aspiring journalist, it's quite scary, because you come to this and you hear these kind of stories and you're scared. You're like, what will happen next if a person like Jimmy Savile did something like that?
Paul Nuttall.
Well, I think the one thing that's upset me really about this story over the past couple of weeks is that people are talking about it as if, oh, well, you know, that was the culture in the 1970s type of thing. But look, paedophilia isn't about culture. Paedophilia is a crime, it's a serious crime, and it needs to be knocked out. But in terms of the BBC, I agree with John Simpson. I think the BBC is facing the biggest crisis that it's faced in the past 50 years. And now what we've got is we've got people passing the buck, people trying to pass the blame onto people who are lower down the food chain, shall we say, in the BBC. I haven't lost confidence in the BBC. I've lost confidence in the BBC hierarchy. And I feel as if there's a bit of inevitability about this now. Like the Andrew Mitchell case, I think it's gone on too long. I think it's only going to get bigger, and I think in the end heads will roll, and I suspect it will end up with the Director General having to go. But look, the real point in this is that 300 people now have come forward and said that they have been victims. They're the people we should be focusing on, and we should wish the police well in their investigations, because there are perpetrators still out there who need to be brought to justice. Now, what do we do with Savile himself? Well, his gravestone has been removed. We've had street names which have been taken down. I would suggest the next move, how to deal with Jimmy Savile, would be let's strip him of his knighthood. It'll take a change in the law, let's do it, strip him of his knighthood, and also let's get the Catholic Church to do with his papal knighthood, to do away with his papal knighthood to boot, because that man needs to be punished even in death.
You sit on the gangway there.
Do you think that everyone in entertainment dealing with young children should have a CRB check?
Vince Cable, I'm sure they do, don't they?
I'm sure they do. If they're employed, they will have CRB checks. But can I just go back to the original question, as Catherine asked, which is the BBC fatally damaged? I mean, it is damaged, but not fatally. I would say in its defence, what other media organisation in the world would put out a programme attacking itself, which is what it did with the Panorama programme, rather brutally exposed the complete failure. And I think, the public almost certainly do wonder what on earth these extraordinarily highly paid executives were doing and making such a complete crass mishandling of this. But that isn't the central problem, and I agree with the other speakers. The real issue here is not the programme that the BBC didn't put out and the editorially bad decision. The real appalling thing is how this man operated for 3 decades or longer, enormous cases of abuse. The real scandal, which I think really does need investigating, is why was it that in 2009, when he was still alive, the Crown Prosecution Service had a lot of evidence in their hands They had the evidence of people like that very brave woman, Karen Davis, who appeared, the cancer sufferer, who explained brutally what had happened, and yet they didn't prosecute. I mean, that really does need pursuing. But I agree with the panel on the broader question that you know, it isn't about who said what to whom in the BBC. The real crime here is that paedophilia on an epic scale was tolerated, people turned the other way, prosecutions were not pursued, and that's the really deep scandal. Okay.
Let's not there on the top right-hand side, yes.
Thank you. Just widening this slightly to the broader issue of BBC governance, I think I heard Chris Patton give a talk a day or two ago where he was very apologetic and supportive of BBC management. Now, I thought the role of the BBC Trust was to act as the guardian of the licence payer. And I don't see that they are maintaining a sufficiently independent position on this. They seem to be acting purely as cheerleaders for BBC, the management line, as opposed to the viewer and licence fee payer.
Okay. Emily Thornberry.
There's a couple of things I want to say about this. Well, I don't know how many people here watched the Panorama programme, but it was really harrowing, I thought, to watch. I thought watching Karen Ward give the evidence that she did, and also the little boy, the boy who'd been a Cub Scout, who'd been on Jim Will Fix It, and him being picked out by Savile and having a ribbon put round him and then taken back to a dressing room and being abused, was something I won't ever forget. I mean, and I also thought that what was really shocking, frankly, more shocking than anything that's been happening recently, was when he was going around on Nationwide and he had a bus and he was using the bus to take kids into the back and abuse. And rumours were going round saying something was going on, and it was taken up to higher management. And somehow or other, higher management only spoke to other people on the floor. They didn't speak to the people on the floor below, like the people who'd been around and who actually might be able to tell them one way or the other, and turned a blind eye. And then so it continued, and it continued for decades. And I agree, actually. Do you know what? I agree with you, Claire. Again, this may be the only time I ever will. But I agree with you that actually we should be focusing first and foremost on the victims. I'm really disappointed in the Crown Prosecution Service for letting down these victims. You know, when evidence comes forward, I'm really shocked that they did not go ahead with prosecuting. And it's for that reason that I wrote in my capacity as Shadow AG to Her Majesty's Inspector of the Crown Prosecution Service the day after this stuff came out and asked for an independent inspection.
And that is being investigated now.
It's being investigated by the Crown Prosecution Service. I mean, it's a little bit like the BBC doing an investigation of itself, or the Health Service doing an investigation of itself, or Broadmoor doing an investigation of itself. I actually think that Harriet Harman is right, that we need to have a larger investigation, and we need to look at, you know, the sexualisation of 15-year-olds, the way in which girls are not taken seriously, the way in which we treat them, you know, and frankly, you know, it is not something that simply happened in the 70s and not happened since. We just need to see it from Rochdale. Yeah. We need to see Rochdale and see when we get vulnerable victims, you know, they need to be treated with particular care and with some responsibility, you know, and to see these people come forward and say, I feel so guilty about what happened. I feel as though it was my fault. If only I'd complained, many other generations would not have been abused. That's appalling to hear that.
The man with the beard there in the middle.
Where are we going to find the Hercules to clean out this Augean mess that we have in the public sector? We've got the BBC investigating itself over covering up of paedophilia. We've got MPs with the snouts in the trough again. We've got all sorts. We've got coppers. The Hillsborough thing's just come out again. We can't get away from it until we find some way of actually really going in and shaking everything down, root and branch, and kicking this wickedness out.
I think the BBC's investigations are independent. They've appointed outsiders to do it.
Yeah, it's a firm of lawyers who are used for handling the firestorms that you normally get when things like this happen. So they're hardly independent, because I was reading today, one of the biggest clients of these lawyers who are doing it is the BBC.
I mean, can I just say, I mean, it's not just the BBC you've got to answer questions here. It's the CPS, it's the national press, actually, because the rumours were well known, and we know that the national press looked at it in 1992, a certain newspaper, and it was dropped for legal reasons. 5 police forces were investigating Savile, and I think the NHS has questions to answer for giving them the right to roam round Leeds.
They gave them a bedroom in Stoke
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So all of these organisations have got questions to answer. It's not just the BBC.
Okay. We'll go on. I'll take a question from Taj. Oh, just before I do, the chairman of the Conservative Party complained that when he was on Question Time 2 weeks ago, he was given a brief by the BBC about what he should say about the BBC.
I've had no briefings.
You've had no
I want
briefings.
to assure you.
Good. I'm glad to hear it.
Fact.
I'm glad to
I wouldn't
hear it.
listen anyway.
Good. Taj Bra, please.
Should David Cameron give the European Court the two-finger salute by not granting prisoners the right to vote?
It's a curious position on this right to vote, because the Prime Minister says over his dead body will prisoners get the right to vote, and at the same time his own Attorney General is saying, advising a committee that actually it will be, well, let's just quote the words, it could be thrown out by the Council of Europe, compensation claims will be made, and Britain will be seen by other countries as moving away from our strict adherence to human rights laws. So it looks as though Prime Minister and Attorney General are rather loggerheads, Vince Cable. What's your view?
I don't think so, and he doesn't need to give the European Court the two-finger salute, because the European Court are not arguing that prisoners should be given the vote. They're saying that not all prisoners should be excluded from having it, which is a very, very different proposition. I mean, I totally agree with the Prime Minister that when people are put in prison, they lose their liberties, and one of their key liberties is the right to vote, and he's absolutely right, and that's the way Parliament has voted. What the European Court has said is that not everybody should, as a matter of principle, be stopped. At the moment, there are people, for example, who are in prison for not paying fines, who are allowed to vote. I would have thought there are other cases too. I mean, I was recently at an open prison in Lancashire, and before people are released, they're no threat to the public, they're allowed home at weekends. I mean, you've already got some people who are half in, half out of prison. It scarcely requires enormous imagination to see how the principle which the European Court laid down could be honoured in the law.
It makes
so
me
the two positions are not in contradiction.
David Cameron, it makes me physically ill to even contemplate having to give the vote to anyone who's in prison.
Well, people in prison at the moment can vote, I think in some specific cases, if they're,
so he's
for
wrong.
example, findable. As a matter of fact, no, I share his indignation at the idea that extreme cases, whether murders or rapists or whatever, should be treated in the same way as everybody else. But nobody's actually proposing that. What the European Court has ruled is that there shouldn't be a blanket ban. And that seems to be sensible and right. And balanced, and something that could be entirely reconciled with his position, which is mine, and the views of Parliament.
Emily Thornberry, you're the Shadow Attorney General. There was a big vote against prisoners getting the right to vote last year, I think it was. Do you think Cameron is right and should say no, absolutely not, or is Dominic Grieve's argument right that
I think
possible?
I would start with it's Labour's position that we are against the idea of prisoners having the right to vote, convicted prisoners having the right to vote. It is Parliament's view, and frankly, it's the public's view as well. Now, in my role as Shadow Attorney General, I obviously also have to give legal advice. And so my legal advice would be that the European Court is saying that it is wrong for us to have a blanket ban, that we would be in breach of our international obligations if we didn't do something about this, and therefore, indeed, ministers would be in breach of the ministerial code. I mean, you have to, as Attorney General, tell, the Prime Minister or the leader of the opposition these truths, because these are truths, and we need, as lawyers, to be able to give them that advice. I mean, there is developing a doctrine which is called the margin of appreciation, which is basically saying we all sign up to the European Convention. We all say, as countries across Europe, that there are certain basic standards that we must comply with. But Europe is beginning to understand that countries do have different cultures, different backgrounds, different politics. And over the years, there have been a number of decisions in relation to prisoner voting, and they are beginning to more and more understand that there is a margin of appreciation. I mean, I just don't think the European Court are going to go to the wall on this with Britain.
So you defy them?
If you compare...
Is that what you mean?
If you compare us,
I mean, you're
for
doing
example,
lawyers' talk at the moment, or Shadow Attorney General.
You've asked me as
talk,
Shadow Attorney General, and I'm telling you as Shadow Attorney General, this is the advice I would give to Ed Miliband. I would
and
also
if Ed Miliband
say...
said it sticks in my craw to give a vote to a prisoner,
I'd say, well, for 13 years, we did not give votes to prisoners, and as a politician, as well as a lawyer, my politician's advice would be different.
OK. So there's lawyers' advice and politicians'
Well,
advice.
as Attorney General, you have to straddle both horses. That's why I've said my lawyer's advice is one thing,
yes,
political
as we
advice.
discovered during the run-up to the Iraq War.
No.
Well, I agree with the Prime Minister on this. It makes me sick to my stomach, the idea that prisoners should have the vote. But what makes me more sick is the fact that our own sovereign Parliament, our own elected representatives, have voted to say no to votes to prisoners. And actually, we're being told we have to do it by a court which actually isn't even in this country, by judges who are faceless. It's absolutely wrong.
Claire Perry.
Oh, sorry. Can I just make another point on this? I mean, look, criminals have broken their contract with society. Society should break its contract with them. Now, here's the interesting point on this. At no point in the European Convention of Human Rights does it mention votes. In fact, it was the Attlee government that made sure that it wasn't mentioned. So we're in a situation now in this country where the only people who can't vote are peers, felons and lunatics. Now, I can see all sorts of legal wrangles coming, because where are we going to go? The logical conclusion is we give prisoners the votes, we give the lunatics the votes. Actually, some could say that the lunatics run the country, but there we are.
All right.
And here's a big point. What are we going to do, David? Are we going to defy the fines, or are we going to leave the ECHR? Because we can't. I tell you why. Because to be a member of the European Union, you have to be in the European Court of Human Rights. And it's things like votes for prisoners which actually make people more sceptical about Europe, and it's actually one of the reasons why more people want a referendum on our membership of the European Union.
It's not, of course, well, we can argue about how concomitant it is with membership of the Union, but Taj Bro, you asked the question. What do you make of the answers so far?
Vince Cable said that it's not all prisoners are going to be banned from voting, but you go to prison for having committed serious crimes against society, so you forfeit your right to have a say in who should be running our country. I just want to say the European Convention on Human Rights itself is a very good piece of law, but for far too long, for far too many years, some decisions have been devoid of common sense and human responsibilities.
Right. Mehdi Hasan.
I don't agree with you. I don't actually think that people go to prison for serious offences. I think there's a bigger question here. We lock up far too many people for all sorts of minor offences, for all sorts of non-violent offences, for all sorts of trivial. We have one of the highest per capita prison populations in Western Europe. So I don't even buy the argument. Not everyone in prison is a crazy psychopath, and no one is suggesting giving the crazy psychopath votes. So Vince is right there. This is about blanket bans. And your question was about giving a two-fingered salute to the ECHR. I mean, if Vladimir Putin is watching Question Time on iPlayer catch up, and he heard your question, he'd be delighted. If the president of Belarus was watching, he'd be delighted too. We can't go around saying we want to give two fingers up to international human rights law and then go around and lecture the rest of the world that they must follow that same human rights law. That's deeply hypocritical. And as for Paul's point about how unpopular it is and sovereign judges, just a couple of weeks ago, Theresa May was keeping Gary McKinnon in this country, a hugely popular move on the basis of human rights legislation, on the basis of the ECHR. So suddenly it's wonderful, and suddenly it's the enemy.
Okay. I'm going to stop you because I've got... is there somebody with their arm up there, hand up there? No. All right, you, sir. And then I'll come to you, Claire. Yes.
I'd just like to call Paul up on... did you call people who are sectioned under the Mental Health Act lunatics? That's quite offensive.
All right. It does stipulate quite clearly that the people who can't vote in this country are peers, felons and lunatics.
All right. Claire Perry.
The European Court of Human Rights was set up by Britain as a way of preventing genocide ever happening again in Europe. It was a fine and noble aim, and it has strayed so far from that remit, in my view. I had the pleasure of being part of the UK delegation to the European Council. You think our money's being wasted there with people talking nonsense? You're right, that's what's happening. On this issue, I have to say, I am slightly in the wishy-washy camp of thinking prisoners who are being rehabilitated perhaps could earn this right. It's part of becoming a responsible citizen again. But what I want is that decision to be a sovereign decision here. It is a decision for British politicians and British courts. And frankly, Mehdi, you talk about Russia and Belarus. The scale of human rights abuses going on amongst other countries in Europe pales, it's just so much bigger than this petty picture.
Which bits you want to put two
I
fingers
think
up
that
to.
given that the court has a
human rights are.
multi-year backlog of cases, we would absolutely be reasonable in doing what the Prime Minister says, which is it is a decision for us. Come on, sue us. Bring it on.
Thank you very much. We've got only a few minutes left, but we've got UKIP here, we've got the Liberal Democrats here, we've got the Tories here, we've got Mehdi Hasan as a political commentator here, and we've got the Shadow Attorney General. We've got a question from Aidan Watson, please, and we only have a few minutes to answer it.
In recent polls, the Liberal Democrats have come out as fourth behind UKIP. Should they leave the coalition before they lose whatever support they still have?
Yes. Vince Cable.
No, we're not going to leave the coalition. We've taken on a very challenging, very difficult task. The country faced a major emergency 2.5 years ago, serious economic crisis. We felt we should contribute to that and provide stable government over 5 years. There are a lot of things we disagree with the Conservatives about, and we'll continue to argue with them, but the core purpose of the coalition remains intact.
What about slipping behind UKIP?
Yes, well, we'll see whether the UKIP party win 50-plus seats at the next general election. I suspect they won't, but let's argue that when we come to it. We think we have a good record and we will defend it, and I think the public will understand that we did something difficult but right, and that will be recognised when we come to the next election.
Paul Nuttall, might be the Tories that ought to leave the coalition if they see you making headway, shouldn't it be?
Well, we'll talk about that down the line. I mean, UKIP is the fastest growing political party in Britain, and we're polling now around 10 to 12%, quite regularly in opinion polls. We're expected to do well in the Corby by-election. In fact, I expect us, we're fielding more candidates in the Police Commissioner elections than the Liberal Democrats. That sort of tells us where we are at the moment, and we're projected to go on and win the 2014 European election. Well, all right. European election. Let's see where we are in 2015, because it could be very interesting indeed.
Mehdi Hasan, do you think it's time for the coalition to break up purely in self-interested political grounds?
Look, Vince
do you think Vince is right to stick
Vince
with
points out that UKIP won't win 50 seats the next election. The problem is Vince's party won't win 50 seats at the next election. That's the problem. And come the autumn of 2014, as Lib Dem MPs in marginal seats are staring into the abyss, the cry will go up, call for Vince, and I think there'll be a great moment there to see whether they have the backbone to get rid of an unpopular leader, try and get in another leader who used to be quite popular, and then get a bit of a bounce, a bit of a honeymoon period. If they time it right, they might be able to save themselves. Otherwise, I suspect with the economy going as it is, they're heading for meltdown.
Well, the problem...
Claire Perry.
Well, the economy, back to Eamon's very first question, the economy is healing. We are dealing with the deficit.
0% growth.
We came together because we were facing the biggest peacetime economic crisis this country has ever seen, thanks to the totally irresponsible behaviour.
Yeah, we get the speech.
And you made it worse.
Are you alarmed by the rise of UKIP?
Well, look, Paul, forgive me, what is your policy for cutting the deficit? You don't have one. The point is...
Don't ask him, because you'll get it, Claire. Claire, just make the political point. What is your view of the rise of UKIP and the effect of...
I think UKIP is a natural, it is a tough, slow recovery, that UKIP is a natural protest place for many people to go who could never bring themselves to vote ever again for Labour, given what the wreckage was wrought on the country. It is a natural protest. Vince, I know I'll be fighting against Liberal candidates. We wish each other well, but the coalition will last until 2015.
And you have no time, not much time for
UKIP
then?
UKIP, I think
UKIP have a lot of time for the Tories to be here. They keep wanting to flirt with you and have...
Really?
David Cameron wants to call them loonies, closet racists.
I think that the issues...
And then they talk about... Yes.
I think the issues around Europe really concern far more people than certainly the Labour Party realises. Right. I am not concerned about the rise of UKIP.
Emily Thornberry, you're out of all this, of course, because you're not...
How long have I got?
You've got about 45 seconds.
OK, in 45 seconds, I'd say, of course, they've got to leave the coalition. They will not be forgiven unless they do. They have been propping up this Tory government for too long. If without them, we would not have had the changes to the health service. Without them, they would not have had the changes to tuition fees. Without them, we would not be having these terrible cuts. People will never forgive them. And quite frankly, it is about time they pulled out, because people want another government. We'd like to have an election. Let's get ourselves a proper government that will deal with this deficit and debt in a responsible way. In a responsible way, and get us out of the recession. That's what people want.
How?
Thank you very much, and thank you not least for finishing in 45 seconds. You can come back. Our time's up. Next week we're going to be in central London as America gets ready to elect a new president. We've got Jerry Springer, the controversial television presenter. He used to be mayor of Cincinnati for the Democrats. We've got the former Foreign Secretary David Miliband, Ed's brother, and we have a prominent but as yet unnamed Mitt Romney supporter there with us to see balance. So that's next week. The week after that we're going to be in Bexhill in Sussex. If you'd like to come either to central London or to Bexhill, just visit our website. The address is on the screen there, or call us 0330 123 99 88. Thank you for watching this week. My thanks to our panel. Thanks to all of you who came here to Slough to take part. Until next Thursday from Question Time, good night.
And the debate continues next on BBC One with former political correspondent John Sargent on the BBC's leadership and troubles this week.